This week, we're continuing our sermon series in the book of Samuel. We're seeing how God's Spirit led the prophet Samuel and King David as they guided their nation through difficult times. Last week, we were invited to see the world in the way that God sees it, to look past the surface appearances of people and situations and discern the hearts of the people that we're with and the situations that we're in. Well, this week, we read the story of David and Goliath. The story begins as the Hebrew army is arrayed before their enemies, the Philistines. And the hero of the Philistine army came out and started taunting the Hebrews. Started telling them to send out their best fighter so that he and that person could settle this dispute man to man. Well, the Hebrews are afraid. The Philistine soldier is bigger than any person they've ever seen. And they've heard these stories of how fearsome he is in battle. No one volunteers to go out and face him, except for one person, David, son of Jesse. Now, David is not the most likely of people that you would expect to volunteer to go out and face down this giant adversary. David is not an experienced soldier. He's never trained in armor. He's never used the modern weaponry of the time, like the javelin. David has spent his time as a shepherd. In fact, when he volunteered to go out there and meet the nation's enemy, he was told to go back home. He didn't stand a chance in this encounter. It's only when David persisted and said that he wouldn't back down that King Saul permitted David to go out there and meet Goliath on the battlefield. Well, most of you know the rest of the story. Goliath tells David that he's going to cut his body up into pieces and feed it to the birds. David says that he will prevail because his trust is in God. Well, these two men finished trash-talking each other. And David picks up a stone, puts it in his sling, and sinks it into Goliath's forehead. David not only saved the day, but he saved his nation. I have two questions about this story, though. How was it that David had the courage to go out there and meet that challenge that day when he had no formal military training? And by every account, he was overmatched. And why was David the only one among the Hebrews who had that courage? No one else volunteered, just David. Well, there may be a clue in the story that helps us answer these questions. When King Saul tells David that he isn't capable of beating Goliath, David says that he's had experience before that would prepare him for this. David says that in his years protecting his family's animals as they were grazing in the wilderness steppe, there were several times when lions or bears came. They tried to steal away the animals. David would chase down those lions and bears, pull the animals from their teeth, and if the lion or bear put up a fight, David would grab it by the jaw and kill it. It would take a great deal of courage to face off against a bear. Some of our youth spent some time in Alaska, and some of them were kind of hoping to see a bear. But, they carried bear spray with them just in case. Well, it took a lot of courage, or how David framed it, a lot of trust in God to face down those lions and bears. David had this pattern of trusting God in his day-to-day life as he was out there watching over the animals. And what he says is that prepared him for this big challenge with Goliath. And I think that might be the key to David's courage. David had a history, a ritual of trusting in God over and over and over again. So that when a really big situation came along, his trust was trained up and ready to go. Perhaps this might explain our gospel reading this morning also. We read in Mark chapter 4 that Jesus was out in this boat with some of his students, and a storm came up, and the disciples were deathly afraid. They thought the boat would fill up with water, capsize, and all of them would drown. Jesus asks them two questions. He says, "Why are you afraid? And why don't you trust me?" Maybe at this point, the disciples had not had enough experience with Jesus to train up their faith. They didn't have enough history with him to see how he had worked in their lives before, so that they were ready when a really big challenge came their way. Well, I think this is one of the reasons why it's so important for us to engage in spiritual practices like prayer. As we pray, we take note of the ways that God shows up in our lives and in the lives of the people around us. When we offer up prayers and then we see God's provision, our faith is trained up so that we're ready when a deep challenge comes into our lives. It seems to me that the story of David and Goliath is not a story of a person who created this huge, momentous courage out of nothing. It's the story of a person who day after day, in the small things in life and in the big things in life, trusted God and took note of how God had taken care of him, so that when that big challenge came, his faith was trained up and ready to go. So friends, what spiritual practices will you continue this week, or maybe even begin for the first time, to train up your faith in both the small things in life, but also to be ready when the big challenges come?